Hello and welcome everyone to this lecture series, Introduction to Contemporary China A. My name is Florian Schneider. I'm the Senior Lecturer for the Politics of Contemporary China here at Leiden University, and I will be guiding you through a series of lectures on contemporary Chinese developments, specifically on society, politics, and economics. In this brief starting video, I would like to welcome you to the course, and I will be introducing you first to an official position of what China is in the 21st century. Following this, we're going to take a look at various different perspectives of what China might mean today, and we're going to conclude with some thoughts on what it means to be modern. So let's dive right in. To get us started, I've brought with me here a video from the National Tourism Administration that was published on YouTube in 2017 with the aim of attracting people to travel to China as tourists. Now I'm showing you this because it also gives us some insights into how a Chinese official organization wants to portray China at that particular moment in time. So let's watch this video together, and I would recommend that you already take some notes of what you might recognize or what you might find noteworthy in this video, and I have a question for you afterwards so that we can discuss what you think of this video. So that is the tourism video that I wanted to share with you, and my question for you is, what can a video like this actually tell us about China? And if you want to, you can pause the video when I have questions for you like this, jot down a couple of extra notes, or even go back to earlier segments of the video to review things, for example, rewatching this particular video. If you feel ready, continue, and I will share with you some of the observations that I made. So now that you've had a chance to think about it, let's take a look at 4 issues that I find important about this video, all under the general observation that this video is about self-perceptions of the Chinese government and specifically its tourism industry and the way that the tourism administration tries to brand the Chinese nation for foreign visitors. And as you've probably noticed, quite a bit of this video is about tradition and about culture. So we get to see a particular take on what makes China unique and special throughout these different regions that are portrayed here. So that includes famous tourist sites, it includes traditional dance, it includes garments, traditional clothing, and of course quite a bit of dancing minorities. The second point is that we also get a glimpse of what modern China looks like, specifically sort of a hyper-modern China defined by its urbanism, by transportation and logistics, by high speeds, and by these massive skylines of cities like Shanghai, for instance. And did you notice how this is not just reflected in the visuals that we see, but also in the acoustics? So the music soundtrack starts us off with a very traditional theme or traditional sounding Chinese theme, and then ends up with a high-speed techno track that resembles the modernity that we actually see on screen. The next issue I wanted to emphasize for you here is that the entire video is informed by a particular developmental narrative. Throughout, we are constantly reminded of the so-called Silk Roads. And it's important to keep in mind that these are plural Silk Roads, a number of different networks and routes that lead from China through the Middle East to Europe. And this video places development in China and tourism into perspective by using the Silk Roads idea as a framing device. Now, it is an open question of whether this emphasis on the Silk Roads is actually useful in attracting tourists, so why is it in here? The reason is that the Chinese government rolled out a massive developmental agenda in 2013 that is still ongoing, called the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. And at the core of the Belt and Road Initiative is the idea of revitalizing the so-called Silk Roads and using them for economic development. So as you can see from this video, government agencies, including in this case the Tourism Administration, draw from this framework of the BRI in order to sell their particular story. And finally, I find it noteworthy what is left out of a video like this. What do we not get shown? For example, there are no pictures of pollution, there are no images of overcrowdedness, no indication of poverty or of inequality in China, all issues which we will be talking about throughout this lecture course and throughout the coming years, but which are of course not part of a tourism video which is trying to brand China entirely in a positive light. So we need to take these kind of videos with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, they can tell us something about how a state administration is trying to envision China at the start of the 21st century. Now, an important thing that I would like you to keep in mind throughout this entire lecture series is that there is no one single correct way of making sense of China. In fact, there are a myriad of different ways of making sense of China and trying to understand what China means in the 21st century. And you see this if you look at some of the extremes. One common perspective is the perspective of critics, particularly in America and in Europe, but to some extent also in Asia, for example in Japan or in India, where a lot of critics view the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China as an explicit threat either to liberal democracy or to economic security and safety, or in some way as a military threat in the region. Then there are the enthusiasts, those who primarily look at the Chinese economy, see the massive success story there and the potential for growth and the incredibly large market, consumer market in China. And what they then see is opportunity and the ability to invest in China and become rich. In some cases, this enthusiasm also extends to politics. For example, when proponents laud the Chinese Communist Party for its ability to govern such a complex society, when they celebrate China's authoritarian system and see it as a model for future politics. And then there are those who milk both sides of that story, combining, depending on what they can use at any moment in time, enthusiastic hyperbole with similarly hyperbolic threat scenarios in order to mobilize people, mobilize supporters, and tell narratives that benefit their quest for power. So now, more than ever, we really need people who can make sense of China without the hyperbole, who are willing to take a look at the conditions on the ground, see the complexities, and provide the kind of nuance that politics and journalism at times sidestep. And those people should be you. So far, I've mainly shown you political positions on how to make sense of China, and rather extreme ones at that. So let me turn to an artist called Liu Yang, who has worked in both Germany and in China, and has tried to make sense of China from a more cultural, social perspective. I have another video that I want to share with you here, a video of Liu's work, and I would like you throughout to ask yourself what are interesting takeaways, but also is there anything that you notice that you think might be worth criticizing? So these artworks are part of an installation called East Meets West. And as you can see here, the contrast is in blue between the West and in red the East, where we have to assume that East really mainly means China, because this is where Liu is from, and that West is mainly informed by an understanding of living in Germany. So what are your thoughts of seeing these artworks and watching this video? Personally, I think there's a lot to like. It is beautiful art. It is extremely cleverly done. There's a lot of creativity that goes into some of these depictions, and some of them are extremely well observed as well. So for instance, the observation that transportation has developed very differently in Germany than it has in China, and that people have progressively moved towards bicycle and green transportation in Germany, whereas in China everyone wants to have a car today, is both accurate and it's interesting because it allows us to draw conclusions and maybe develop a debate or a discussion about how development works in these different places. Having said that, there are also things we should be quite wary about, specifically the idea that there is a uniform understanding of what Eastern folks and what Western folks think on certain topics or how they behave in particular situations. It would be problematic enough if this was a story of how the Chinese behave in a certain way and the Germans in another, which would be tricky because, are actually all Chinese people alike? Are all Germans alike? But to extend that logic to this dichotomy between East and West makes it even more problematic. So all in all, a lot of generalization has gone into these depictions, and there's a certain cultural essentialism at its root, which assumes that Chinese and Western people behave in particular kinds of ways that are unique to each of these places. That may not be the case. The reason I've shown you this video and these artworks is to already desensitize you a little bit to the idea that it may not make all that much sense to create these dichotomies between East and West, or to talk about such a thing as the West. What is included? Who do we really mean? And is it really appropriate to generalize about China in this particular way? Sadly, this happens all the time. This generalization takes place in journalism, from politics, and to some extent also in academia. So you have to provide a check on some of these assumptions and complicate matters in your studies. And that is what area studies is all about. And I will return to area studies in another mini lecture. For now, let's take away from this experience that things are usually much more complicated than they seem in simple illustrations. And that is most certainly true for the study of China, which poses a number of problems, including what we can and actually do know about the Chinese context. This is James Palmer, senior editor at the news magazine Foreign Affairs, who has provocatively made the claim that nobody knows anything about China, including the Chinese government. Now, he's basing this claim on various observations about all the different things we don't know, whether it is scholars or journalists, about how things work in China, and the way that we cannot know. And this is also why he includes here the Chinese government, because Chinese officials are in the same boat. So, for example, we don't actually know what the actual numbers of gross domestic product growth or economic growth in China are. We don't know the real size of the Chinese population. We don't know how politics work at the top levels. We don't know what people think, even though we survey them frequently about how they feel about Chinese politics or about Chinese society, but we cannot really make sense of how honest they're being to us. We don't know how large the military is and how precisely it is being funded, like what money goes into the defense budget. We don't know how good Chinese schools are, for example, when Shanghai again wins the PISA studies. But what does that really reflect? We don't have a real sense of how that data works. We don't know how much crime there is in China, and so on. And maybe most importantly, we don't know what we don't know. So the so-called unknown unknowns. Now, granted, Palmer is being facetious, he's being intentionally provocative in order to make us critically reflect on what we can and cannot know about the People's Republic of China, but I think he has some very important points, and that means that we should always try and view our study of China with some humility and admit that there are limits to how we can actually make sense of this massive country, its economy, its politics, and its society. Leaving aside for a moment Palmer's criticism and the fact that there are so many different viewpoints of what China means today, usually observers agree on at least a number of things. They agree that China is extremely large, that it is dynamic, that it has an incredibly diverse society, and that it is overall highly modern. So let me ask you then, what does it mean to be modern? What is modernity? And you can pause the video here and just take a couple of notes for yourself before I continue. Modernity is actually an extremely controversial concept. It does not, in academia, mean the same thing as it means in common understanding. In normal language, when people use the word modern, often enough they mean contemporary, referring to what is going on today. That is not what modernity means in academic discussions. In the social sciences, modernity refers primarily to a mode of being, and it also refers to the period of time in which this mode of being became popular and the various institutions that have grown out of this modernity. Each of these points is actually controversial. Just take a look at how difficult it is for historians to pinpoint when modernity starts. Some place the beginning of modernity somewhere in the 15th or 16th century. Others make the case that modernity starts with the Industrial Revolution, so in the 19th century, and others make the case that it's somewhere in the 20th century, particularly with the invention of the atomic bomb. So which one is it? And then there's the question of whether we still live in modernity or whether we are now living in postmodern societies, implying that modernity has ended. So this is just one of the many controversies, and there's far more about which institutions to include, for example, or what it means to be modern today. Let me give you a quote from a famous Japan scholar who has worked on modernity and who says this. This is Carol Gluck from Columbia University, and she has written that, in my view, modernity is not a trope, theory, project, or destination, or if it sometimes seems to be all of these things, it is never these things alone. It is instead a condition historically produced over 3 centuries around the globe in processes of change that have not ended yet. Modernity is not optional in history, in that societies could simply choose another regime of historicity for themselves, for such is the tyranny of modern times. Gluck makes the point that modernity has a quote-unquote grammar, so different elements that make something modern, and if you look at individual societies, they combine and recombine that grammar in very innovative different ways, which leads to the incredible diversity of societies we see on the planet now, all of which are modern in one way or another, but not necessarily in the same way. So what are some of these institutions, some of these grammars or grammar components that play into modernity? One element is the institution of the nation-state, a decidedly modern invention, and we are going to be talking about state institutions and the idea of the nation and how nationalism works in other parts of this lecture series. Another observation about modern societies is that they in one way or another try to mobilize citizens, that there's a component of national political participation. This is definitely true in liberal democracies, which use elections to see their participation, but it is also true in other modern societies that are not democratic. They too require some element of participation, or at least claim that they're able to assure participation for their citizens. Then there's the economic component, the economic dimension, especially the idea of industrialization as a fundamental part of modernity, and by extension, the idea of incorporating and linking different societies into a geopolitical and also geoeconomic world order. So an internationalization, transnationalization of political, economic, and social and cultural processes. And finally, there is a move away from agrarian, rural societies and the kind of communal life that they represented towards a more urban lifestyle, which often fundamentally disrupts how people behave and interact with each other. Being modern is a constant struggle, no matter where you look, and the Chinese Communist Party has struggled in particular to create a modern China. And this is also why I'm concluding with these issues of modernity for this very first welcome lecture, just to give you an impression of the various dimensions that we are going to be diving in as we explore modern China in much more detail in the coming lectures. So I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.